Caitlin Clark just did something no player in WNBA history has ever done. She reached 1,000 points, 250 rebounds, and 250 assists faster than anyone before her. On paper, it was a legendary opening night performance. A moment meant for celebration, headlines, and highlight reels. But instead, what unfolded left fans uneasy, confused, and deeply concerned. Because while the stats were historic, the reality on the floor told a different story. Clark wasn't just playing basketball, she was fighting through discomfort, repeatedly heading to the locker room, and visibly dealing with something far more serious than a bad shooting night. And even though Indiana Fever pushed the game into overtime, the result didn't matter as much as the question hanging over everything. Is this the beginning of a season where Caitlin Clark's body becomes the biggest storyline in basketball? On the surface, this was supposed to be a statement game for the Indiana Fever. Caitlin Clark delivered 20 points, 7 assists, and 5 rebounds. Kelsey Mitchell exploded for 30 points. Aaliyah Boston controlled the paint with 23 points on elite efficiency. Statistically, your big three combined for a dominant offensive output that should win almost any opening night matchup. But basketball games aren't won on paper, and that's where everything fell apart. Because while the stars delivered, the rest of the roster completely vanished. The Fever bench produced almost nothing, combining for just a handful of points across extended minutes. No rhythm, no scoring punch, no defensive stability. Every time the starters sat, the game momentum collapsed instantly. And that's what turned a strong offensive performance into a heartbreaking overtime loss. Dallas didn't beat Indiana because they were more talented at the top. They won because their entire rotation functioned as a unit. Indiana, on the other hand, became overly dependent on 3 players carrying the entire system, night after night, possession after possession. And as the game stretched into overtime, fatigue became the silent killer. The starters looked drained. Defensive rotations slowed down. Communication broke. And a game that should have been closed out early turned into a full-blown survival test. But the most concerning part wasn't even the loss. It was what was happening to Caitlin Clark in the middle of it all. Because while the scoreboard was collapsing, she kept walking away from it. As the game slipped out of control, attention quickly shifted away from the players and toward the sideline, because the Indiana Fever coaching decisions were becoming impossible to ignore. Stephanie White rotated players in patterns that felt disjointed and inconsistent. Lineups never settled. Chemistry never formed. And every time Indiana tried to stabilize the game, the substitutions seemed to break their rhythm even further. Instead of building momentum, the rotations fragmented it. But the real disaster wasn't just confusion, it was production. The Fever bench simply didn't show up. When the starters rested, Indiana didn't just slow down, they collapsed. Possessions ended in rushed shots, turnovers, and empty offensive sets. Defensive intensity dropped instantly, allowing Dallas to attack mismatches and build confidence. The depth gap became glaring, and every minute without the big three turned into a momentum swing for the opposition. Meanwhile, Dallas looked organized, balanced, and prepared. Their bench players stepped in and maintained structure, spacing, and energy. That difference alone quietly shaped the entire outcome of the game. But the most controversial moment came from a decision that fans are still debating. A veteran player who showed strong preseason form was left out of key rotations entirely, a decision that raised questions about trust, strategy, and long-term planning. On a night where Indiana desperately needed reliable bench scoring, those choices only deepened the pressure on the starters. And as the game continued slipping away, one thing became increasingly clear. The system wasn't just struggling, it was exposing cracks that could define the entire season. And right in the middle of that collapsing structure, Caitlin Clark kept disappearing to the locker room. This is where the entire conversation around the game shifted, away from basketball strategy, away from rotations, and straight into something far more alarming. Because during the second half, Caitlin Clark wasn't just playing through contact or adjusting her game, she was repeatedly leaving the floor and heading straight to the locker room. Not once, but multiple times. Each trip created a different kind of silence. Cameras caught her visibly uncomfortable at moments, holding her lower back area, moving with less fluidity than usual. And every return to the court felt temporary, like she was trying to push through something her body wasn't fully cooperating with. That's what made the post-game comments even more unsettling. When asked directly about Clark's condition, the coaching response framed it as routine maintenance, part of managing the body. But the phrasing that stood out most wasn't what was confirmed. It was what was casually implied. That this wasn't a one-time issue, that it could continue, and that it might be part of an ongoing process throughout the season. For fans, that changed the tone completely. Because when a franchise player is already requiring in-game treatment in the very first game of the season, it raises uncomfortable questions about durability, workload, and long-term planning. And this isn't happening in isolation either. Clark's recent injury history, including leg issues, contact-related setbacks, and preseason discomfort, has already made every physical signal more significant. So when she starts making repeated trips to the locker room in a high-intensity overtime game, it doesn't get dismissed as nothing. It gets analyzed, overanalyzed, and suddenly, every possession she plays feels like part of a much bigger story, not just about winning games, but about surviving them. Because in this moment, Caitlin Clark wasn't just Indiana's best player. She was becoming their biggest question mark. As the game pushed deeper into overtime territory, Indiana's problems stopped being isolated mistakes and turned into a full structural breakdown. On defense, rotations were late. Help coverage was inconsistent. And every possession started to feel like Dallas was finding the easiest possible answer. Once the Wings sensed hesitation, they attacked it relentlessly, driving, kicking, and forcing Indiana into scramble mode possession after possession. What made it worse was how predictable the collapse became. When the starters were on the floor, Indiana could stay competitive through pure offensive firepower. But the moment substitutions began, everything shifted. The pace slowed, the spacing disappeared, and the defensive identity completely dissolved. Dallas didn't need to do anything complicated. They simply stayed patient and let the gaps appear. And they always did. By the final stretch, Indiana looked physically and mentally drained. Communication broke down on switches. Closeouts became late contests instead of real pressure. And rebounding effort dropped at the worst possible time, giving Dallas extra possessions that slowly buried the game. But the most frustrating part for fans wasn't just the loss. It was the feeling that this outcome was avoidable. Because the talent was clearly there. The stars produced. The issue was everything around them. And as the final whistle approached, the reaction online wasn't focused on highlights or box score performances. It was pure panic, frustration, and disbelief at how a team with so much offensive firepower could look this fragile when it mattered most. But underneath all of that noise, one concern kept coming back to the center of the conversation. If this is how the team looks in Game 1, what happens when fatigue, injuries, and pressure start stacking up over a full season? And that question only became louder once Caitlin Clark's condition entered the discussion again. The moment the final buzzer sounded, the conversation didn't stay about the loss for long. It shifted almost instantly from basketball execution to something much more emotional and divided: Caitlin Clark's condition and what it could mean for the entire season. On social media, fans weren't debating the overtime result anymore. They were dissecting every replay of Clark walking to the locker room, every slow moment where she appeared to adjust her back, every brief pause between possessions where she looked uncomfortable. And the reaction split into two clear camps. One side insisted this was normal early season management, just routine maintenance for a superstar carrying a massive workload and defensive attention every night. The other side saw something far more alarming: a pattern forming too early, too often, and too visibly to ignore. That tension is what turned a single game into a full-blown narrative event. Inside the media discussion, the focus widened beyond Clark alone. Analysts started pointing at Indiana's structural issues: lack of depth, inconsistent defensive identity, and the heavy reliance on three players to carry almost every meaningful offensive possession. Because when a team is that top-heavy, every physical concern becomes magnified. And that's where the psychology of the locker room came into focus. Post-game remarks described the environment as positive. Despite the loss, despite the defensive breakdown, and despite the obvious exhaustion visible on the floor. For some, that sounded like maturity and resilience. For others, it raised a different concern, whether the standard for accountability inside the team was slipping too early in the season. Meanwhile, the coaching staff continued to frame Clark's situation as maintenance rather than injury, but the phrasing itself created more questions than answers. Words like ongoing, management, and maintenance don't calm a fanbase already on edge. They amplify uncertainty. Because fans don't just listen to what is said. They listen to what it implies. And right now, the implication is that this is not going to be a one-game storyline. It could be a season-long balancing act between performance and preservation. And that reality changes everything, from rotations to expectations to how far this team can realistically go when their most important player is already being carefully monitored from day one. But just when the discussion seemed to settle on concern, a new layer of speculation began to form that took the entire debate in a different direction. As the noise around Caitlin Clark's condition kept growing, a new theory started circulating among analysts and fans, and it completely reframed how people were interpreting everything happening on the court. Because what if this isn't random? What if this isn't just early season discomfort or bad timing? What if the Indiana Fever are actually managing something far more deliberate behind the scenes? That's where the so-called hidden load management theory started taking shape. The idea is simple on the surface, but explosive in implication. Clark's minutes, substitutions, and even her unexpected trips to the locker room might not just be reactive decisions. They might be part of a carefully controlled system designed to protect her long-term health across a grueling season. And if that's even partially true, it changes how every coaching decision is viewed. Suddenly, reduced on-ball usage isn't just a tactical choice. It becomes preservation. Every time the ball leaves her hands, it's not necessarily about strategy. It could be about reducing physical stress. Every substitution isn't just rest. It might be pre-planned maintenance. But here's where the theory becomes controversial. Because fans don't watch basketball through medical spreadsheets. They watch it through impact, rhythm, and dominance. And when the most electric player on the floor is not consistently controlling the game, frustration naturally builds. That tension is exactly what makes this situation so volatile. On one side, there's a coaching staff potentially trying to protect a franchise cornerstone for the long term. On the other, there's a fan base demanding maximum usage, maximum visibility, and maximum aggression every single night. And in the middle of that conflict sits Caitlin Clark, producing elite numbers while simultaneously being monitored in a way that no superstar wants to experience in real time. But this theory also exposes a deeper problem within the roster structure itself. Because load management only becomes necessary when depth cannot absorb responsibility, when bench production collapses, when defensive stability breaks down, and when offensive creation relies too heavily on one or two players, every minute becomes high stakes. And that's where Indiana's biggest vulnerability is becoming impossible to ignore. Even if Clark is being protected intentionally, the system around her is not stable enough to support it without consequence. Which means every adjustment creates another imbalance. Every rest creates pressure elsewhere. And every attempt to preserve the future may be impacting the present. And as this debate intensified, one final layer emerged: the emotional and psychological disconnect between what the team says publicly and what fans believe they are seeing unfold in real time. When you step back from all the noise, the overtime loss, the bench collapse, the coaching debates, and the injury speculation, one truth becomes unavoidable. Indiana's opening night didn't fail because of effort. It failed because of structure. The stars delivered. Caitlin Clark still produced at an elite level despite visible discomfort. Kelsey Mitchell looked like a pure scoring engine. Aaliyah Boston controlled stretches of the game with efficiency and power inside. On any normal night, that combination wins comfortably. But this isn't a normal situation, because everything around them is still unstable. The bench production isn't just weak, it's almost non-functional in high-pressure moments. Defensive identity disappears the moment rotations shift, and late-game execution becomes chaotic instead of controlled. That kind of imbalance doesn't just cost one game. It becomes a season-long pattern if it isn't corrected quickly. And then there's the bigger, more sensitive storyline that now shadows everything else: Caitlin Clark's physical condition. Even though nothing catastrophic was confirmed, the repeated locker room trips, visible discomfort, and ongoing maintenance framing have changed how every possession is being watched. Fans aren't just reacting to performance anymore, they're tracking durability. That alone shifts the pressure on the entire organization. Because when your franchise player is also your most physically monitored asset, every decision becomes a balancing act between winning now and protecting later. And that's where Indiana finds itself heading into the rest of the season. A team with elite top-end talent, but fragile depth. A superstar capable of historic performances, but being carefully managed in real time. A coaching staff trying to stabilize rotations while also dealing with expectations that demand immediate results. So the real question isn't whether Indiana can score enough. They already proved they can. The question is whether they can survive the long season without the structure around their stars collapsing under pressure. Because if Game 1 is any indication, the Indiana Fever aren't just chasing wins this year. They're trying to hold everything together long enough for their system to fully mature. And that makes every upcoming game more than just another matchup. It makes it a test of depth, a test of coaching decisions, and most importantly, a test of whether their biggest star can stay healthy while carrying the weight of a franchise still trying to find its identity. If you've watched this far, you already know this story is just beginning. Now it's your turn. What do you think is the real issue here? Is it coaching, roster depth, or something bigger? Drop your take in the comments because this season is going to be defined by moments like this. And if you want full breakdowns after every game, subscribe because this story is only getting started.